We're going to now go to Alessandra Asteriti from Italy, Germany. She's an academic. She's going to be talking to us about the importance of women's sex-segregated spaces, such as toilets and changing rooms, and arguments for keeping them.
Specifically, I want to point out that when we talk about sex-segregated spaces or spaces only for women, we're thinking of at least 3 different circumstances, 2 of which are being talked about a bit. And the first one would be simply social spaces on the basis of political affiliation or sexual orientation and so on. The second one would be spaces that are dedicated to women that are in specific circumstances, and there can be specific circumstances of vulnerability. For example, refuges for raped women or supported housing for disabled women, or even prisons, because women are, of course, vulnerable in prisons, and a lot of women that are in prisons have a previous history of domestic violence, sexual violence, and so on. And finally, we have those spaces that we dedicate to all women: toilets, changing room, hospital wards, where we normally segregate on the basis of dignity, privacy, and safety for the women involved. And this is on the basis not so much of international laws or domestic laws or regulation, but although sometimes these spaces are specifically protected, but on the basis of social norms and cultural norms and the acknowledgement that opening up these spaces where women are vulnerable because they may be in a state of undress, or because they may be ill, or because for religious reasons they cannot share spaces with men, or because for a previous history of trauma, they may be traumatized by the presence of male-bodied people. For all these reasons, we guarantee that there are spaces where women have guaranteed that only females will be using those spaces. And the attack on these spaces is happening across the board. We have heard that it is now impossible to have lesbian bars, lesbian events. We have seen now in Tasmania, the law just passed yesterday, where it would be a crime for lesbian women to exclude trans women from lesbian-only events. This, of course, again, when we talk about trans women, we're talking about males who have transitioned from 0 to 100% towards appearing as a female, as a woman, although never, of course, being one. So we have this attack on social events for women, for lesbians, and so on. We have the attack on spaces in prisons, and we have seen, we have attacks even on the care for disabled women, where there are countries where it is not guaranteed anymore. The care for disabled women will be sex specific. So you will not be guaranteed that the person who takes intimate care of a disabled woman will be a person of the female sex. It will just be a person with a female gender identity. Or in Scotland, where they tried to pass a law, the woman who had been raped could select a doctor to conduct a gynecological examination of their same gender and not of their same sex. And only after a long, prolonged debate in Parliament and the proposal to change the legislation to specifically select sex and not gender, this amendment was not passed. But many of the progressive parliamentarians were pushing for forcing women who had been raped to be examined by a person who identified as a female, not a person who was a female. So we have the attack on that. And then we have the attack on the general restricted spaces, such as toilets and changing rooms. And we've seen this all over the world. And oftentimes this is not on the basis of laws, but is on the basis of policies that are implemented sometimes expressly against the current legislative framework. Specifically in the UK, the Equal Act protects sex spaces, so spaces that are only for women. They are specifically included in the Equality Act, and they exclude both males and people with a characteristic of gender reassignment, therefore transgender women. However, Stonewall has been infiltrating universities, hospitals, schools, companies, and they've been issuing guidance that contradicts the position contained in the Equality Act and allows, actually demands that all these, from companies to schools to universities, that they open up their toilets and changing rooms to either to everybody, so they make them gender neutral, or while maintaining them as male and females, allow this to be happening on the basis of self-identification. And it's important to say here, we always continuously self-identify as someone, but not in the sense that we identified with our sex, but that we are aware of our sex. So we select female or male toilets on the basis of the sex that we know we are. Just like a woman who's pregnant will spontaneously avoid to go on a ride that says that ride in an entertainment park should not be used by pregnant women, not because she has asked at the entrance, but because she knows she is pregnant and therefore she shouldn't use it. Therefore, when people say, oh, what are you going to have genital inspections? We do not need genital inspections because we know the sex we are. When people argue for opening these spaces, they're arguing for either making that knowledge irrelevant or allowing people to lie about their sex. So either saying, oh, all toilets are gender neutral, so your sex is irrelevant, and yes, this is a female toilet and a transgender woman is female. Now, what do I think is the best argument outside of the law? Because as I said, the law actually normally protects these spaces, or very strong social mores protect these spaces. The attack is from the outside, is to dismantle those laws where they exist and to make people afraid to reassert their previous social norms and replace them with a queer gender norm, as it were. So what do? We have to take the point of view of the users. And the users of female toilets, female changing rooms are women. And the idea is that even if only one woman would object to the presence of a male-bodied individual in that space because of trauma, because of religion, because of safety, dignity, privacy reason, that should trump any other objection. So if transgender women want to use a female space, since they cannot guarantee that no woman will ever not object, because although we know that sexual offenders are a very low number, which both amongst the male population and the trans women population, those numbers are quite low, and we know that. But we also know that most women will have been exposed to some sort of sexual violence. They will have been raped, or they will have been harassed, or sexually assaulted, or flashed, or any of the other. I'm sure you can all think of your own experiences of sexual violence. So that should be our yardstick, not the fact that the population of male offenders is very low, but that the population of female victims is very high. So on any day that you are in a changing room or in a female toilet or in a hospital ward, you will have in that room a woman or several women who have been the victims of sexual violence. Therefore, their right not to be traumatized again by the presence of a male in a space where they do feel vulnerable is paramount. If this is in the end, I don't agree there's a proportionality analysis. This is a categorical issue. Man are man, women are women, so we do not need to do a proportionality analysis between conflicting rights. Men just do not have a right to female spaces. But even if we were to assume that males do have a right to female spaces in specific circumstances, A proportionality analysis will fall on the side of the women. The right of women to have their privacy, dignity, safety respected prevails over the right of males to use a space that they feel matches not their sex, but their gender identity. So as the equality law in the UK actually says, you have the right to have separate sex spaces. And the test is very low, because the test is if you assume that the person of the other sex may reasonably object. So if you have a toilet, for example, and you think that a woman in that toilet may reasonably object to the presence of a male-bodied individual, that is enough to have separate male and female toilets on the basis of sex. So as you can see, this is not a very high test. In legal terms, this is the lowest that you can go. You don't have to prove some compelling reason to keep female spaces separate. All you have to prove in UK law is that a woman may reasonably object to the presence of a male-bodied individual. And it is obvious that the fact that this individual may have a certificate that asserts that his legal sex is female is completely irrelevant, because people do not travel around with certificates proving their sex. They don't use documents to access a toilet. So obviously it's the perception that matters. If an individual is perceived as male, that individual will not be allowed. And this is important because it shifts the default. The default is not prove to me that these males are dangerous. The default is prove to me that these women were never victims. This, unfortunately, the status of women is the status of past or potential victim of male violence in a very high percentage of cases. So these alone, regardless, then you may also have religious reasons. There may be Muslim women or Orthodox Jewish women who cannot, because of their religion, share spaces with male individuals. But alone the fact that if you shift the perspective to the female experience, the female experience is that when I am in a room where I cannot escape, and I may be in a state of undress, or I may be undergoing a miscarriage, or I may have gone in that toilet to escape somebody who was following me. In that situation, I have an absolute right not to be further traumatized by the presence of a male, even if it's the nicest man in the world. The point is not these people are dangerous. The point is these people are male-bodied individuals. And that's where we are. We are on the outside of them. We don't see their gender identity. We see their body. We are only our bodies if we don't believe in religious stuff. All I see is the outside, and I see a male. And so I have an absolute right to exclude males for those situations where that is required, for safety, for privacy, for dignity. We have a right to consent to who sees her body. We have a right to consent to be exposed to a male body in a state of undress. All these should be basics. And I think beyond the law, because then the law recognizes this in many circumstances, but beyond the law, there is an argument to be made that is grounded in feminism and bodily autonomy of women against the imposition of the male body in those circumstances when we do not want them. These are male bodies that we do not want. So this, to me, in short, is the most fruitful approach because it shifts the default. The default is, what does a woman feel? Not what will a man do. That is irrelevant to us. Even if it's a nice man, it's a man. And we have a right to say, we cannot have men in this space because we cannot distinguish between a sex offender and a nice man, because we cannot distinguish between a man and a trans woman without asking, and surely they're not demand that we ask others to define our reality. Our reality is what we see. And what we see are male bodies. And the transsexual people, that understand that also understand that they should not use those spaces because they are female spaces and they are not female. I think for now, this is all I'll say. I didn't want to go again too much in the specifics of the law and get bogged down also because every country has slightly different. One important thing to say is that the international law as of now does not recognize as a matter either of treaty, except tiny limited regional circumstances, so either a treaty or customary law does not recognize gender identity. Women in international law have rights on the basis of sex. So those separate spaces can ultimately derived from existing international treaties. For example, UNESCO campaigns very strongly for female-only toilets to guarantee girls' right of an education because it's a well-known link between the absence of female-only toilets and access of girls to education in many countries. Ironically, then in Western countries, this link is not made, but this link is also present. I mean, we have good educational attainment for girls also because we have rules and regulation in the UK, for example, that establish that every school has to provide separate toilets for girls and boys above the age of 8. So this is ingrained in the West, and we're trying, and they're trying to also make sure that everywhere else in the world it happens. So this movement against sex separate toilets goes against international practice at the UN level. The UNESCO makes it clear that female-only toilets are crucial to girls' attainment in school because otherwise girls are too much in danger of sexual assault and rape. So they are absolutely essential. Plus, of course, for privacy reasons, girls having their period for the first time, all these things that should be obvious to anyone who considers the topic in detail. And then, of course, the fact that women had to fight and women died in the UK, suffragettes died to gain the right to separate toilets. It was a way to keeping women at home, not to provide public toilets, because they had to be within distance of their home or of a friend's home at all times, because they couldn't go to the toilet outside. So of course it was that was a civil rights movement to gain spaces, toilets for women at the time. And now we are here 100 years later, losing those spaces on the basis of some misguided inclusivity that doesn't really mean anything for women. There is no advantage that I have discovered for women to replace sex with gender identity. I literally cannot think of one single positive outcome for women when sex is forgotten and replaced with gender identity. I wanted to point out the importance of the UN level because we focus sometimes on the domestic situation, but there is a supranational, international attack on women's rights. That's quite something to witness. And at the UN level, yes, it is Victor Madrid, who is the expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. He recently issued a report that said every human being has some form of gender identity. I find this quite scary, actually. I emailed him, I wrote to him on Twitter, and I asked him to explain what the factual basis for this assertion was, because I didn't have a gender identity. And I was wondering if that made me a lesser human or subhuman. So you have the right to express your belief as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others not to believe. And you have the right to express your gender identity as long as you don't break rules that have to do with propriety and public safety and everything else. And that should be protected by all means. But to establish a category of people that then it is open and that once you enter that category, you can switch your sex with your gender is extremely dangerous. And then to say that sex is not significant, but gender is even more dangerous. I mean, I know that internationally and nationally, there are people that are arguing for eliminating sex from the birth certificate. Now, the UN specifically says that sex should always be recorded at birth because female infants, infanticide is a major problem. The UN calculates 140 million women are missing in the world because of abortions, lack of care, and female infanticide. So these are incredibly high numbers. And to tell the international community, it is good practice not to record the sex of this baby on the birth certificate. It's extremely dangerous because we need that data. We need that data to know how many girls die at birth or are aborted or died in the first 5 years of life. This data is essential. And to say that this is not essential, that women is anybody who identifies as a woman, immediately excludes the most vulnerable females, the babies, the girls, the disabled women who cannot identify as women because they are disabled. With any ideology that targets the most vulnerable in a group is quite a dangerous ideology in my book. And I'm not mincing words because I think this is important to say this. And you said, you're right, you say, Amanda, this is like you are fighting 1,000 battles. But in reality, it's only one battle, and it's the definitional battle. And it's to say sex matters and gender doesn't.